Good evening, everybody. Thank you very much for being with us this evening. My name is Liz Mosley. I'm an editor at Tortoise Media. And this thinking is the continuation, really, of perhaps our most enduring investigation, journalistic investigation, that began in another thinking a couple of years ago. A person walked into our newsroom and shared an experience that they had had when at university, an experience of sexual harassment and abuse that we picked up, and my very excellent colleagues Chris Cook and Ella Hill followed up and have produced a number of sort of fairly significant pieces of investigative journalism that looked principally at university institutions and their institutional inadequacy, you might call it, at handling, responding to women and men who come forward who have experienced sexual abuse. And when the website Everyone's Invited started very recently, we felt that it was an extension of something that we've really sort of made our business to really care about at Tortoise, albeit now in the frame of secondary schools rather than universities. And so this evening's conversation is designed to sort of really try and talk about that, to understand how we might journalistically find a way in that will be productive and new in making a change to something that we care about and worry about. We're joined by a group of people who have all experiences of this from different lenses. And I'm going to come in a second to Soma Sara, who's the founder of Everyone's Invited. And she can only be with us until 7 o'clock, so I'm going to stop talking in a minute and get chatting to Soma. What we normally say to people who join us on Thinkings is, please make sure you use your real name, please make sure you put your camera on. Obviously, for reasons that are self-evident, because the topic we're talking about today, if you don't feel like you want to use your real name on screen, if you'd rather just talk rather than have your camera on, if you'd like to join in, that's absolutely fine, we completely understand. Whatever makes you feel comfortable, but we would really like to hear from you, either in the chat with my colleague Patricia, who is sort of marshalling the chat today. Let us know what you think, respond to the things that we've had to say, ask questions, whatever you think is going to be useful and interesting, and I will pick on people who've made interesting comments in the chat to join in the conversation later on. So if I start first with Soma, lovely to see you. Thank you very much for being here. It might just be worth a really quick 2-sentence version of what Everyone's Invited is and why you started it.
Hi, thank you. Everyone's Invited survivors their stories. It was created with the intention of exposing and eradicating rape culture. But, you know, at the heart of Everyone's Invited, it is about storytelling and creating a platform for survivors to share and working against the stigma and the shame that surround these issues in society.
Soma, it may seem completely obvious to yourself and to many of people who are here this evening what we mean exactly by the term rape culture, but it is quite a new term to a lot of people, the idea of it. So what is it that we're talking about when we say rape culture?
So rape culture is basically the kind of academic definition is when thoughts and attitudes and behaviors in society have the effect of normalizing and sexual violence. So to explain that a little more clearly, it's connected, and it,
Soma, I'm struggling to hear you a little bit. I think your Wi-Fi is a bit patchy. It may only be me, but if everybody else is struggling to hear Soma, sometimes it helps if you turn your camera off and we just try and hear your voice. I don't know if that's something, or log out and come back in again. Have another go. I heard it's the beginning of what you said was rape culture is a sort of attitudes and behaviours that normalise sexual violence principally.
Can you hear me better now?
Yes, I can hear you better now.
Yes, so rape culture, so the sort of academic definition is when behaviors and thoughts and attitudes in society have the effect of normalizing and trivializing sexual violence.
Right.
But it's really about it's an incremental culture where everything is interconnected, and it includes things like slut shaming and misogyny and misogynistic bullying and sexual harassment and coercion and image-based abuse, which is an umbrella term for abuse that manifested in response to the rise of social media and technology. So things like revenge porn and the non-consensual sharing of intimate photos and upskirting. And it's really about how these behaviors can actually act as a gateway to more extreme acts such as rape and assault. So it's essentially about dehumanization and dehumanizing individuals. And, you know, when people are dehumanized, people don't respect them, and that's when they become vulnerable to violation. So again, everything within this culture is interconnected. And it's not just about the behaviors of individuals, it's also about the structures in society that allow the violence to continue.
So there's a lot in there. We're not sort of tackling an insignificant set of challenges. When the website went live, and we saw in the data at the beginning, there's now over 16,000 testimonies from mainly girls. There's some teachers, and there's a few boys, I think, in there too, who've experienced sexual harassment, abuse, violence on a sort of spectrum of experiences. And when we started talking about the website in Tortoise, just between us, you know, what's happening, what do we make of this, you know, it was interesting, the range of different responses to it from various different types of people. I wonder if you've been surprised at all by how people have responded to the website itself.
I'm very much, and it's been an extraordinary journey so far, just to see the level of support as well as the engagement in this conversation. Because when I started this project, most people didn't know what the term rape culture meant, let alone believe that it existed. So to be at this stage, having, you know, even being in this thinking, having you using the term rape culture, having that within the public consciousness, seeing it in print, seeing it in the headlines, is a huge achievement and step for Everyone's Invited. And we're really proud to have come this far. And to be honest, I never thought that it would have happened this quickly, to have engaged a nation really in this conversation. It's just extraordinary to see the level of people really engaging.
It is interesting, Semi, you're right, that the phrase has sort of given a label to it, sort of made manifest something that people have variously been aware of as sort of lurking, but perhaps hadn't joined together before. Like you say, there's an upskirting thing, there's the dick pic thing, there's all of that stuff is sort of packaged up now and given a label. I wonder whether you have been aware of any negative consequences of the existence of Everyone's Invited.
Well, I guess, you know, acknowledging that rape culture exists is a difficult thing for people. And it's very difficult for people to come to terms with the fact that everyone in society is complicit in rape culture. And I think, you know, it does provoke some negative responses in that people, you know, it's very difficult to self-reflect and to go on a journey of introspection and to actually look back at your own experiences and look back at your own behavior and realize how you may have been complicit in perpetuating this culture. Because it really is so normalized. It's not just about the behaviors and the experiences, it's about the attitudes and beliefs that are deeply entrenched in the social structures of society. So I think, you know, it is difficult to come to terms with, and especially because the word rape culture and the word rape, it feels very extreme. And to come to terms with the fact that we are all complicit in something that's so extreme and unacceptable is difficult for many people to accept. But I'm very hopeful and encouraged by the response so far, and how many people have really reached out and expressed to us how, you know, reading the testimonies has been such a profound education to them, in that it's completely transformed their understanding of these problems and opened up their perspective in seeing how everything is interconnected, how allowing your friend, excusing a friend of yours who you know is problematic, who you know is abusive, is actually being complicit. You know, slut shaming someone else, jealous of them, that's also contributing to this culture. These minor things are problematic and harmful.
Thanks so much, Soma, and it's very helpful to sort of set the scene so we all know what we're talking about. I'm going to come in a second, and thank you very much to everybody who's already joining in the chat. Do please keep going. I will come to you, I promise, but I want to make sure I come next to Patrick Moriarty, who is the head teacher of the Jewish Community School in Barnet. And Patrick, thank you very much for being here this evening. I'm sure you had a busy day, but your school is mentioned in one or some testimony. I'm not sure if it's one.
Yeah, it doesn't also.
Of the testimonies on the website. And I think one of the things that, if you haven't looked at the website, some of them are completely anonymous, some of them just have a school name. Tell us a bit about how you found out that your school was sort of one of the ones that was there.
I can't remember the sequence of events. What I recall was, as a school, we were getting ourselves exercised by the Sarah Everard news story. And then I think it was a student at the school brought the website to our attention, one of our own students, and said, you know, you might want to have a look at this. And I don't know whether it's helpful or unhelpful. It's an interesting reflection for you, Soma, as to, like, there's no search facility. I think in the end, I decided I was grateful that there wasn't one, although I did go through every single page, trying to find the extent of the reports in there. And then, you know, sort of disappeared down a rabbit hole of horror, to be honest. Not so much the ones about my school, although they were bad enough, but just the sheer volume of testimonies. And then went to try to begin making sense of it, but with colleagues, with other students at the school as well.
Patrick, how do you begin to make sense of it? If these are a sort of, was it a complete, were you utterly stunned that this could be happening in your school?
No, not at all. Because, you know, kids are kids, and particularly when they are in parties with free-flowing alcohol and relatively low levels of adult supervision, this kind of stuff is going to happen. And, you know, my student body is quite articulate. You know, they know what's right and they know what's wrong. I mean, I hope all students are like that. But it wasn't a total surprise. I mean, I went through so many different emotions of not denial that it was the case, but, well, hang on a minute, how do we know that this is, you know, is this from our school? Is this really our responsibility? All sorts of different emotions. And I think I tried just to let that process happen, actually. And, you know, wrote an article about it, and then ripped that up completely and wrote a totally different one as I went further on the journey of you just have to stare it in the darkest eyes and let its truth sink in, even while at the same time, like I'd said, that it's the anonymity is both the strength and the danger, but you just have to kind of suspend it and say, look, here are 16,000 people. There is a huge problem here, and the step one is simply to kind of let the shame wash over you as a member of society. I love what Soma says about we're all complicit in it. And, you know, those of us who are middle-aged white men in positions of power in schools, we've really got to take our share of the responsibility there and then pick ourselves up and try to hear the voices and do something about it.
Patrick, I'll share the link in the chat, wrote a very thought-provoking, I think, piece in the TES, sort of in this time, like as you say, as you were processing what you discovered about your school and thinking about what to do with it. One line from it, if I don't mean to embarrass you, but reading it out, it says, "Shame spawns shame, and I wonder how it is that violations unthinkable when I left school 35 years ago are now commonplace, and why, despite decades of legislation and progressive initiatives, things are getting worse, not better." I know it's not that long ago that you wrote that and that you were feeling those things, but do you have you come closer to any more answers as to why things are getting worse, not better?
Not sure that I have really. You know, we could talk about culture wars, we could talk about political correctness, we could talk about the shifting patterns and, you know, and kind of backlashes against one thing or another. We could talk about social media, but when I left school, and we're talking 35 years ago, I thought in my naivety, and I was at an all-boys school, which has also been multiply mentioned now, I thought we were on a progressive, gradual, backward, you know, 2 steps backwards, 1 step forward, or hopefully 2 steps forward, 1 step back, but we were getting towards a more equal society where these things were not going to happen anymore. Honestly, I don't know what happened, but I feel responsible. Just because of the position that I occupy, I feel responsible for that. And you know, when I talk about the shame in that article, that's a lot of what I feel. Not that I'm personally responsible, but I take my share in that. I don't know why we're going backwards, honestly.
Patrick, you pose 5 key questions, sort of exam questions, if you like, in this piece. How do we make it less difficult to report experiences? How do we improve everyone's communication of and understanding of consent? How do we counter the fears, falsehoods, and fantasies of pornography? You talk about managing relationships with social media, drugs, and alcohol. And then the final one, I think, is the one that there's some really that sort of gets to the nub of why this feels so difficult to sort of figure out a way forward, which is, and people in the chat have been mentioning, which is how do we stop the harming and shaming of girls without demonizing boys? And I think that's the thing that straight away in the chat came up as why this feels so challenging to unpick. I wonder if I might ask Soma, how would you answer that $64,000 question? How do we stop this happening to girls without demonizing boys?
I think it's really important to teach things like empathy very early on. And, you know, I think this education has to happen a lot earlier on than a lot of parents might expect. And I don't think it doesn't necessarily have to be about sex. It can be about basic concepts like empathy, like consent, in a very basic way, and instilling boundaries from a young age, or also maybe instilling being an upstander or an active bystander as a family value, standing up for victims or people who you believe are being mistreated. If you try and instill those in children, I do believe that change can happen, because at the end of the day, this is fundamentally about, again, dehumanization. And if we're encouraging empathy and prioritizing that, we're helping young people understand what it's like to be in other people's shoes, and you know, looking at other sides of the story, and understanding that there are other people who have feelings and emotions, and you know, they are valid and exist too. So just empathy is so important. And also encouraging reconciliation, because I do believe there is a lot of that, there has been a lot of anxiety and shame and stress that is existing at the moment, in response to the testimonies as well. And I think a good way to hopefully work to something more positive is through encouraging that reconciliation as well, and prioritizing education as opposed to criminalization or demonization or ostracizing people, because that's not going to help the culture. If you cancel someone or an individual or a demographic or an institution, you don't fix the problem, you actually just remove it from view. And when we focus on, again, an individual, a demographic, or an institution, you really narrow the problem and make it seem like it only exists there, and you actually completely miss the point that this is a culture that is universal, that is endemic, that is so pervasive, and we all need to take responsibility for in order for it to change.
Yeah. Thanks ever so much, Seema. I'm going to just bring in a couple of people who've made comments in the chat before coming in a second to Mike and Georgina. Mike, who is an expert in safeguarding, and Georgina, who can bring a legal perspective. If we go first to Ilana Hutchinson, I think you work with, I think you work for Jewish Women's Aid.
Yeah, hello. Sorry, I'm just can't see everyone because I came on my phone thinking I'd be with my children at this time, and then I ran away because the conversation was so interesting. Yeah, we teach about so much of what has been mentioned. We teach about, I used to just go into schools and talk about healthy relationships and consent, and we touch on violence, sexual violence for older kids. And now we're going in, we're trying to start addressing these issues at a much younger age, because we found really recently that year 11s, it's too late. A lot of the students are saying, why didn't you come in at a much younger age?
Right.
And I felt that maybe we weren't ready as a society to discuss these things. And now, with one of the brilliant things that everyone's invited has brought to the foray is that we've got it on the agenda, and people are ready to talk, and kids are ready to talk. And what I've noticed is that schools are getting in touch with us saying, please come in, because our students want you to come in. Our students want us to discuss about rape culture. Our students have been talking about it on social media, and then we as a school have to try and provide something. And I think that teachers don't really know where to begin. And so we try and support teachers and try and start these conversations.
Ilana, when you do sessions, just out of interest, do you do boys and girls all together, or do you have them in separate? How does it physically work?
So normally we do boys and girls together. And I feel we get asked that question all the time. And I feel that it's really important for the boys to understand where the girls are coming from. Yeah. And it might be and vice versa as well. It's really important that they learn from each other. And last week we had in one class, we actually had one a girl student, basically stood up and gave a whole monologue about how she was feeling in the class and has been feeling for a number of years. And it really was amazing for the boys to have heard that. But what I do struggle with, which I'd love to hear your thoughts, which is what you said about the boys, how to bring them into the conversations and how to make sure that they don't feel demonized and attacked, because they will get on the defensive if they think that they're being accused of something, and that's really difficult.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Thank you so much, Ilana.
Thank you, and thank you for hosting this. This is excellent.
Of course, it's my job. Thank you very much for your contribution. I'm going to come in a second to Patricia, who's going to talk us through the data, and to Mike and Georgina. But I've just got a note here before we go to Mike from David Tidmarsh, who's talking about why is this a schools issue? Are you there, David? Maybe he isn't. Maybe he's not able to come on. Are you there, David? David Tidmarsh?
Yes, I'm here.
Hiya. You're making a point, which is, why is this framed as a schools conversation? This is not a schools issue.
Well, I don't think it is, because I mean, when I was growing up, you couldn't see any of this sort of culture on television. You didn't hear about it. It was never discussed. These sort of things just didn't happen. As I say, I think I was 15 before I saw what a nude woman looked like. now it's just commonplace. We have to be very careful with my grandchildren to make sure they can't go and see porn on their iPad or whatever. It's just there and free. And it isn't just consensual sex that they can see forced sex, they can see rape. I mean, so if this is regarded as a norm because it's there for everyone to see on our digital media, why are we turning on schools and saying you've got to solve the problem? The problem lies somewhere else.
Thanks, David. I think it's a fair challenge. I'm going to come next to Mike. Now, Mike, you're a safeguarding expert and a former police officer, I understand. Hi,
yes,
Mike.
hi. Yes, yeah, hi, yeah, that's right. Yeah, I'm an ex-police officer, and I was a child protection officer for a while as well back in the day.
Let's start with David's challenge, which is we're missing the point if we frame this as a schools issue, because obviously there are bigger forces at play than just, you know, what's on the curriculum or what training people have. But you work with people in schools, and there is a role to play, I'm guessing, for educators in the classroom. How do you respond to that challenge, which is, you know, we're fighting, you know, with a pea shooter against a huge, you know, army here?
I mean, I would agree that what goes on in society is reflected in school, isn't it? And I think that you know, the schools have got a major challenge to face, because what they're up against and you know, some very big problems, in the sense that they're kind of on the front line of safeguarding in many ways. So they're seeing this kind of behaviour on a day-to-day basis, and they're having to manage the problem, you know, on a day-to-day basis. So it's and the evidence, I think, is pretty strong that you know, essentially what's happening in schools is that schools are seeing these behaviours, and you know, as I say, what's happening in society is reflected exactly in the school as well. So it's a major, I think, challenge, because schools, yeah, and if we look at the background of safeguarding, schools are now having to manage a whole range of safeguarding issues. It's not just harmful sexual behaviour and the rape culture. It's there's a whole range of things they have to deal with. Yeah. But there's absolutely no doubt whatsoever that you know, what's been described is the kind of day-to-day experience of children in school.
I mean, that's a quote and a half in itself. There's no doubt whatsoever that what's been described is the day-to-day experience of children in school. You know, we're not talking about something that is isolated. We're not talking about something, you know, when Then for Winds Invited first was published, there was quite a sort of, it almost felt like a desire to identify, well, this looks like a private school problem. You know, it sort of felt like that was what they sort of wanted to be a commentary to say, oh, this is an isolated set of cultural behaviours associated with very privileged kids or something like that. That isn't my read on it now. What's your take on that?
I would agree. I mean, I think it's right across the board. You know, it isn't, I don't think it is just a private school problem. You know, we have a lot of contact with safeguarding leads in schools on a day-to-day basis. So we work with around 5,000 schools across England and Wales. And, you know, the kind of reports that we're getting from schools is very clear. It's right across the board. It's concerns that are being raised, not just in private schools, but in locally maintained schools, further education colleges, and even in primary schools as well. So it's you know, it is right across the board. It is a societal problem, which is reflected in what's happening, you know, inside the school gates. No doubt whatsoever.
Let's just talk a little bit about processes and things. How well prepared, you work with schools, with safeguarding officers in schools, with other representatives in schools. Let's say we talk about the part of the experience which is somebody's come forward and said this happened to me. So not the how do we modify, how do we teach better behaviours, how do we manage, but the part where somebody comes forward and says this is my experience. How well equipped would you say secondary schools in general, private and state, you can make a distinction if you feel there is one, are to handle that in the right way? What even is the guidance?
Yeah, I mean, I would say generally that the safeguarding practice in schools, you know, has improved a lot over in recent times. There's a lot of guidance in place, as you say. So there's very specific guidance. So we have statutory guidance keeping children safe in education, and also there's very specific guidance dealing with sexual harassment and sexual violence between children in schools, which came out in 2018. So there is a lot of guidance in place, and all staff get safeguarding training, and the safeguarding leads in schools get specialist training. So they are trained to manage these reports. So I would say that in response to these incidents, when they are reported, I think schools actually respond pretty well. And they have got the skills and the experience to be able to manage those problems. I think the more difficult issue, I think what we're kind of hearing from Soma and from others, is the fact there is a big underreporting issue with this particular problem. So I would say that's the challenge that schools are up against, that it's a question of, well, it's not even just underreporting, it's actually a complete absence of reporting in some cases. So that's the problem. If you're not in a position then to be able to identify the problem because children are not reporting things into the school, into teachers, it becomes really difficult then to identify safeguarding trends and to be able to respond in the right way. So very often schools are just not in a position to see the problem in the first place. And I would say that is probably the biggest challenge that they're facing at the moment.
It's a really interesting point, Mike, and it segues neatly, almost like we planned it, into a question I was going to put to Patricia. Now, Patricia worked most recently on our hidden homicides investigation, different thing, similar flavour, and is a data journalist here at Team Tortoise. And when we were looking to put together our sort of sense maker guide for the beginning of this thinking, we really struggled, didn't we, with data points?
Yeah, and what's kind of consistent across all reporting of this nature. So hidden homicides was about domestic abuse, homicides. When we're looking at sexual assault, sexual harassment, the data is really, really patchy. And that's for a number of reasons to do with, I think, sort of poor cultural understanding around it, often very low reporting on the issue, as Mike has mentioned, and various other issues, is we just don't see it. In the UK, there is, I've just forgotten the name. So the ONS has a sort of child sexual abuse report that it produces, but even there they acknowledge that this data is really, really, it's kind of a patchwork of different things that they can find. They have both child perpetrators and adult perpetrators, but that information isn't split out. We don't know the context for any of these crimes. And this is, sexual assault and sexual harassment. It's just sexual assault. So we don't know whether this is happening specifically at schools. We know that there's kind of a social issue here, but we don't know the extent of it at all. The work that we did to try and kind of get some background on this and to try and understand the extent of the issue was the following. We looked first at, SOMA's Everyone's Invited site. So Ella Hill, Kim Dara and I did a report on this a while ago where we scraped the website and we pulled out some of the data from there to try and understand what the kind of key themes were that these children and young people were bringing up in their schools. And so a lot of the themes we saw there were the ones being discussed today. So there was a lot of mention of consent and context, party, drunk came up a lot as things that children are sort of struggling to navigate. There was a lot of mention of digital as well, which is coming up in the chat a lot as well.
Yeah.
So nudes, pic, photo were words that came up a lot on the website. So we have an understanding that this is a problem. We have 16,000 testimonies from children who mentioned about 600 plus schools where they're saying something's going on. In terms of how we actually can verify that data, there's some external data to back it up. There's a study by the National Education Union and the UK Feminista, which found that a third of teachers in mixed schools saw sexual harassment pretty much every week.
Patricia,
and then go on.
I'm just noticing that there's this thing that comes round again, sort of when we're talking about this stuff, which is to what extent are we just now noticing something that's always been there, and to what extent are we seeing a really steep increase in something that has sort of seems over the past maybe 10 years or so, with the availability of porn, with the sort of blanket use of Instagram, to what extent is it a new problem, I suppose? And I would normally turn to data to try and answer that kind of question, but it's incredibly difficult in this scenario to get a gauge on that, isn't it?
Yeah, I can't answer the question of whether it's getting worse. I can tell you my feeling that it's probably not, that it's probably something that's been consistent. I can tell you why the data is so patchy as well. We don't really have data over time because it's incredibly hard to analyze. We know that only about 15% of sexual harassment and assault cases are reported to the police. And we know that that number has gone up in recent years. So actually, while numbers may appear to be lower for these kinds of instances, and I'm talking about, again, the very patchy numbers that are there, so numbers around child sexual abuse and so on, they could only be increasing because reporting is increasing.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So it's really hard to make assumptions based off that data.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks ever so much, Patricia, and thanks for managing to scrape together what we did manage to scrape together. It feels to me, although we always say the plural of anecdote isn't data, when it's 16,000 complaints of sexual harassment or abuse at school, I think it probably does count as data in some way, shape or form. I'm going to come to Georgina now, if I can. Georgina Calvert-Lee, you're an anti-discrimination harassment lawyer from McAllister Oliverius, and you have deep legal experience of sexual harassment cases, but on campus, so more older people. I wonder if you have a sense from a legal perspective as to whether this thing that we all feel is the case, which is behaviour might start even as young as kids at primary school age, which doesn't have an appropriate degree of empathy, consent, that's off when it comes to sexual relationships between boys and girls, that it sort of escalates and ends up with something really very serious later on. Do we know that that is a pattern?
Well, it is a pattern that we see. I mean, it would be extraordinary if the explosion of sexual violence on campus had just come about from people who had no history of treating other people with disrespect or having sexually problematic behavior before. I mean, I deal sometimes also with these kind of cases at school, but you're right. The biggest extent of my practice area is around rape, sexual assault and sexual harassment on campus. And it's often student on student. And part of the rape culture, it was so interesting to hear it sort of defined and talked about earlier this evening. Part of the normalization of rape culture, or the normalization of disrespectful attitudes between one person towards another, takes place within the institution. So although we can't expect schools and universities to deal with this problem, and we can't think that it is a problem of their making, there's a wider social issues behind it. It is their problem when it's happening to individuals within their campus, because those people need to get an education that's foundational, and they can't be expected, they're entitled to it, they pay for it. Our society needs it, because that's how you get sort of full-rounded members of society that can contribute. And if they cannot get that education because they are so bullied and harassed or assaulted and violated, then they're being denied that education. And so a key problem that we're trying to tackle is the failure of the institution to deal with it. And the way there's a sort of systematic disregard for complainants, or fear of complainants, at least at the university level. And I say systematic because I see it across the board, that there are processes in place that ostensibly are there to deal with complaints of sexual misconduct, but they fail because they neglect one simple principle of justice, and that is, well, two principles: transparency, so open justice, and according both parties equal rights. And what they tend to do is hear of a complaint, and if they think it's a serious complaint and feel they need to do something about it, which is all well and good, instead of having a transparent process in which the complainant is given a role in that complaints process and given the outcome, they take the complaint away from them and just sort of do a quasi-prosecution. against the person complained about, and keep the complainant out of the process altogether, and sort of criminalize, quasi-criminalize the person complained of, so that you have this polarization of the two different parties. And you also have a complainant who feels that their complaint has not been heard or dealt with at all. So I think there are serious problems when institutions don't lean into the issue that they have on their campus, because it affects the way people can get their education, and that affects society at large as well as the individual.
Georgina, do you have any sense of, taking your point that with a university campus, quite often it's young people all living together in halls of residence or whatever, and with a school you would tend not to have that. Do you have a sense of whether it's that sort of everybody lives together environment that might be exacerbating the private school issue, and if people are in boarding schools and sort of cooped up together, living together, is that a fact? Is that a fault line that might be part of that story?
I think it must be part of the story, because a lot of the rapes happen on campus, but certainly not exclusively. And a lot of the sexual harassment does not happen on campus. It happens perhaps partly on campus, but we mustn't forget the online abuse. There was the Warwick University Facebook chat scandal, and that's not the only one. And I think in schools, you hear of many cases of bullying, which is carried out off campus, outside the school, not even in the physical space, but in the virtual space. But I think living together, being cooped up together, yes, is one thing. But I think the fact that we have the social media 24/7 presence in each other's bedrooms, regardless of whether you live on the same corridor or not, means that it's much wider than just those students who happen to be living on campus together.
Yeah, thanks ever so much, Georgina. I'm going to bring in a few more people who've been making interesting and useful comments in the chat. Is Scarlett still here? Scarlett Mansfield. Are you here, Scarlett? Maybe she is.
Hi. Hello. Yeah, sorry, I was just
apologize. Nice to see you. You've gone through a whole journey with this and have worked with the BBC on a report and what have you. Just to give us the sort of edited version of what your experiences are.
Yeah, so I wrote a viral blog post about a month and a half ago now, after Everyone's Invited came out, and I spoke about my experience. I went to a state school, non-fee paying, but it was majority boys, so they let 30 girls into the sixth form, and it was a really toxic experience. And anyway, when I wrote about it, I encouraged submissions and everything, and over 200 people submitted. So the difference with Everyone's Invited is that it was all about a particular school, which isn't to say that obviously it doesn't happen other places. Of course, it happens at all of the schools, but it just went to highlight how much of a problem one school alone can have. So the BBC then started investigating into it, which initially the school denied having any problem at all, saying, because I was an older student, left in 2013, that, it was a historic problem, no longer an issue. And then came even though all of the submissions had been out there, and then the BBC started to do an in-depth research and realised how badly they'd handled all of the cases that had been brought to them. And Ofsted investigated them 2 weeks ago. For at least 3 days they were there. And then the BBC article went live last week with the examples, including same-sex abuse in hallways, for example. Which was different to what we've been reading about online. But it just goes to show that, although I do think the emphasis should be on women, it's still a lot about, boys are affected in this too. It is really everyone.
Yeah, Scarlett, when Mike was talking about his sort of sense of working with schools is that in general, when a complaint happens, they're pretty well equipped. They deal with it reasonably well, and there is fairly extensive guidance in place. That wasn't your experience with at your school.
No, not at all. It wasn't dealt with well, and also mainly people were terrified to say anything. In the girls' common room, we would talk about how rapey and creepy the guys were, and in hindsight, the things that we just normalized were so outrageous. Like, you know, the boys stood together for a photo called the Rape Bro Society. It never made it to the final yearbook, but you know, the fact that there was 12 of them, 3 of whom I know now have raped girls in the year, standing so boldly under the title the Rape Bro Society, and yet our school didn't do anything about it and didn't handle it the right way. They got told off once because they were joking about domestic violence and saying it was all good crack and how it was funny and everything, and one of the boys was forced to make an apology on a Facebook group, but it was so half-hearted, and you know, it just wasn't taken seriously, and no one really cared, it seemed.
Yeah, thank you, Scarlett. Do you have a sense of what I would have? Someone unfortunately had to go. One of the really big challenges with the framing, which is called rape culture, is because it is so big, because the scope is so huge, and I absolutely understand the reason for that it's this whole sort of overwhelming spectrum of small microaggressions that become really big things like what was happening at your school, but that makes it very difficult to nail down with data and to say this is the extent of the problem and this is where we need to tackle it. If you were sort of asking for a specific change to stamp this out, what would you be asking for, maybe in relation to your school that you used to go to?
Yeah, so something I was talking about this last week on Good Morning Britain with Jess Phillips on Wednesday, actually. Like, my one point that I want to stress that I really hope schools and universities alike implement is rating, like anonymous longitudinal evaluation surveys where, you know, you can see whether the measures you're actually implementing have an impact. So yeah, don't follow things that are don't say things like, you know, have you ever been sexually assaulted or raped in the questions. If we ask them, you know, their actual lived experiences, like, have you ever had a nude distributed without your consent, you will far sooner realize the scale of the problem. And also, yeah, if these are then done at yearly intervals, well, termly initially, because they've introduced so many new measures in response to what's come out, that then if we start to increase, well, if we start with a high frequency and then eventually, once it's hopefully got to a lower frequency, do it yearly to see whether, you know, you assess what's going on and then evaluate the changes you can make and change it. And if these ratings were made public, I know that
schools would care,
and universities would care. So yeah, I've tried to email the Office for Students asking them to include a section on their national student survey that already goes out to thousands of students across the country, and is what places like The Guardian and Complete University Guide base their data on. So if there's a ranking for safe people that, like Oxford, or I went to Warwick, so I really appreciate Georgina's efforts there, because yeah, I was there during the rape chat scandal, and if anything, that's like the most mild thing that I heard at the university versus what actually was happening there on a daily basis. That, you know, these universities would then be forced to care because suddenly their reputation's on the line, and they know now they need to implement changes, rather than, oh, we know students' welfare isn't great, but we don't really have an incentive. So I think, yeah, there should be some sort of nationwide thing implemented.
Yeah, thank you ever so much, Scarlett. I could see Chelsea Mayer nodding enthusiastically with your suggestions. I'm just really, really conscious of time. I'm going to come back to Patrick, just reflecting on what Scarlett was talking about and thinking into, I'm going to come to my colleague Chris Cook in a second, who I know wants to ask you a question too. Patrick, since this happened, and I know it's all still relatively recent, actually, it's not sort of a year ago, where are you at in your thinking about what you can do differently and better at your school?
We're still in listening mode, really. We've just sent out a survey, I hope more or less along the lines that have just been described. We have a focus group we've had meetings with year groups, so each can come along and say this is what we think could change. We've got a kind of focus group of teachers and students who are working together. We're getting survey evidence, and we will, we'll listen to what is said there. But I absolutely take the point that we've got a one-off is no good. You've actually got to do it termly and then yearly, because otherwise it's kind of meaningless unless you can see a trend. That's where we're at, but we're certainly not Well, I suppose another thing is, in the process of all of this, there were some real live issues that came, whether they would have come anyway or whether they came because of everyone's invited. It's difficult to tell, but we are working our way through, and I hope we'll listen, you know, not instead of taking action, but we'll listen enough so that we make the right changes
in the right way. Yeah. Is Chris Cook around, actually, my colleague here at Tortoise, Chris is sort of spearheaded with Ella Hill all the stuff we've done on Campus Justice up to now. Hello, Chris.
Hello.
You had a question, I think, for Patrick.
Yeah, so one of the things I think is striking, and lots of in Everyone's Invited, is if you like, is the one of the reasons it caught so much attention is basically because it tends to be grander schools that have appeared on the list. And actually, one of the things I'm a sort of long-term education reporter, and one of the things I think is underestimated in the sector is the extent to which the managerial quality is very variable across education. And actually, if you were to look at, say, the private schools in particular, like the private schools have had their lowest ever year of fee rises this year, and it's still way over inflation. They are institutions that are characterized over the last 20 or 30 years as basically being unable to control their own costs. And when you think of it in those terms, that's quite a good sign that they're quite badly managed. Like they're not able to actually stay within their budgets. By contrast, the state system, actually, you very, very clear and firm expenditure limits. In Patrick's case, I'm also struck that he runs, I think you're still a voluntary aided school, Patrick. So JCOS is a really, really good, I should say, voluntary aided school, with a formidable reputation. But you have a much closer relationship that means you're a local authority supervised school, not an academy. And your relationship with the people that do safeguarding is probably much closer than the average secondary school head in the UK, in England these days. So if someone were to come to you with a serious case in particular, my expectation, my prejudiced, unevidenced expectation is that you would be unusually good and clear about what needs to happen next. You know that you run it's a community secondary school, so it's people don't expect you to select kids for sort of moral purpose, and you're going to get kids who are going to cause trouble, and you know who the people you've got to call are. Whereas, say, private schools, I think, are more likely to be quite badly run. They're more likely to think it will reflect poorly on the school if we have to take action, and they're less likely to know who they have to call at the LA. So I just wonder if those are dynamics that I've got right, or do you think I'm wrong?
I think you may be a bit harsh, but
Chris, harsh.
No. I've worked in both the private sector and the maintained sector. I've seen fantastic evidence of leadership in both. You're right that we've got a close relationship with local authorities, although your distinction between voluntary aided schools and academies, certainly in my local authority in Barnet, that just doesn't exist. There's the same person everybody calls.
Right. I think
she's excellent.
I think I was talking to a local academy near me in Southwark, where I asked the head, what do you make of the DCS? And he was like, I don't know the Director of Children's Services. And this head was like, well, I don't know who they are. So I think there is I just wonder whether there's it's very local authority to local authority, that stuff.
Yeah. I mean, I think the professional instincts are true across all the different professions. What you say about an awareness of reputation may be different. But I don't, when I read the press reports of, such and such a well-known school has responded in such and such a way, I don't look at them and think, oh, I wouldn't have done it that way myself. I think there's probably good and bad leadership across both sectors. So it would be more interesting for you, wouldn't it, if I said, yes, this is a problem that we can divide and conquer. I'm not sure I'm quite convinced by that.
Fair enough, Patrick. Didn't win this one. Sorry, Chris. Good effort.
This disagrees doesn't mean he's right.
It's true. I just want to make sure, because I'm very conscious of time, and there've been so many excellent contributions to the chat we haven't heard from. I wonder if Chelsea might just come on. Chelsea Mayer, towards the end. Chelsea, you've made a number of interesting observations. Now we're sort of getting towards the end of the hour. Of course, we can't do this justice at all in an hour. we quite often, we use these thinkings, as I say, this whole bigger picture investigation started when somebody walked into a thinking and sort of shared an experience. Where do you think is the most interesting area for us to go looking as a way to precipitate change through journalism in this space? Because it's not difficult, unfortunately, to find a school that has a problem, but that in itself isn't going to necessarily be the difference.
Yeah, I agree with you. So I think for me, the conversations around prevalence and kind of trying to find the data to back that up and stuff, whilst it's important, like that's been raging on for years and years now, and there is data out there that says, like, that talks about the scale of sexual harassment and misconduct, and then that also talks about like the levels of underreporting and like how low that is and stuff. So I think we can safely assume, and also we've got 16,000 new testimonies now as well, and everyone's invited, so yeah, that is happening. I think the area to look at now is to try and determine like what good practice looks like in implementing change, and trying to dig around, because there are some institutions, I don't necessarily know of schools, but there are some, universities that are getting certain bits right, not everything right, and it'll be the same in colleges and high schools and stuff like that. So I think it's probably a case now of seeing what is working, what's created change over the last couple of years, what people have implemented since everyone's invited, like all kicked off again, and trying to actually learn from each other and start creating change now based on what's working, because it needs to happen more quickly than it currently is.
Thank you very much, Chelsea. I'm conscious we've already hit 7:30. Sometimes with thinkings, I feel like the last 10 minutes takes me so long to get through, and other times I feel like the whole hour just goes and I've barely scratched the surface of what I really wanted to get at. I want to say a heartfelt thank you to everybody who has contributed openly and honestly and personally in the chat. Of course, a big thank you to Soma, although she had to dash off, to Georgina, who I've got 1,000 more questions for and we didn't have time for, to Mike, and to, oh my goodness, my screen's gone blank, to Mike and to Patrick as well. Thank you for being so honest with what is a really difficult one. There's a few things I don't think we've landed on a very clear journalistic way forward. There's a few things that I'm going to take away. There was a completely fascinating back and forth about single sex schools and the impact thereof, which I think is definitely worth thinking of its own in this regard and other means too. There was a sort of fleeting comment somebody had about the availability to of parents to sort of help parents navigate how to talk to their kids about consent and those kinds of things, and how easy that stuff is to access that kind of support. And there's all sorts of, I think, interesting things that we can just go and have a think about, whether we can come to any conclusions about which types of schools seem to be faring worse versus which types of schools are doing better, where they are on the sort of change program. And that can be a signifier of all sorts of things. But I think there probably is something we can look at, not just the private and unprivate, but other factors too that might put schools in one bucket or another. Thank you very much to everybody. I am 1 minute over time. So do please keep your eyes on Tortoise, because there's more reporting in this space soon to come. Thank you very much to Patricia for your work on the data side, and to everybody for their assistance and contributions this evening. Have a nice rest of the evening. I will see you tomorrow. Bye.